Today we're going to look at the most misunderstood word in the English language. Democracy. Demos, the people. Democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is a little bit like music. There are many different varieties of music. And sometimes it's hard to tell whether something is music or not. Democracy is the same. And it's interesting that people use the word democracy when there was absolutely no indication. For example, the First World War. We're told it was about protecting our freedoms. It was basically a trade war. It had nothing to do with democracy. Rule of the people, by the people, for the people. So what is the difference between parliamentary democracy and direct democracy? What is the difference between a representative and a delegate? A representative, just in case you remember what it is a little bit like you giving somebody a signed blank cheque to make decisions for you for the next 3 to 4 years. And at the end of that period, if you're not happy with what they've done, you vote them out of office and you give somebody else a signed blank cheque. Rule of the majority is not necessarily liberal or democratic. The majority of people in various situations over the ages have done some quite horrendous things, as we currently see in the Middle East. So, democracy, rule of the majority, is basically an illusion unless you have a constitutional framework which recognises basic liberties: fear from freedom, fear from hunger. The dilemma is that if you don't have these basic constitutional frameworks, democracy in many regards is similar to autocracy. Because if you have inequalities, even in a representative democracy, the people, the representatives that are elected over and over again, are those that have the interests of those who exercise power and control wealth. Because power and wealth is needed to win parliamentary elections. In the rare cases where power and wealth didn't win, as we saw with the Whitlam Labor government, we saw a legally elected government removed by the Governor-General. So democracy, rule of the majority, is as onerous as rule by a dictator or an oligarchy. Because unless you have the constitutional framework which protects individual liberty, which protects freedom of speech, which protects freedom of association, which protects you from want, which ensures that you have the basic necessities for life, the type of representatives that are elected to Parliament, despite their best intentions, may not and do not look after the interests of the majority. So what about parliamentary democracy in Australia? We like to think of ourselves as a liberal democracy, but ultimately it's a representative democracy at the local level, the state level, the federal level. Those who are eligible to vote are, through legislation, forced to cast, well, at least cast a ballot, or at least turn up at the polling booth, or give a good excuse why they didn't turn up, and elect a representative. And the reason we have compulsory voting was in 1922, fewer than 30% of the eligible electorate actually voted in the federal election, which makes it very hard to say that a government represents the interests of the people. So we have this major issue. We have a constitution which has no Bill of Rights, has no protection for the individual, as we see with indefinite detention, the fact that it's constitutional. We have a constitution which doesn't protect people from want. That's why we see in a country as rich as this homelessness and all the issues which are related to not actually having enough income to enjoy the basic necessities of life. So it's about power and wealth. So if you don't have a constitutional framework which ensures everybody exercise power, not just by voting in an election every 3 to 4 years, and everybody has access to the basic necessities, then the democracy we have is an illusion. It's more than an illusion, it's a lie. Interestingly, when we saw the British defeat the Nazis in Europe, and a coalition, including the US and Australia, defeat the Japanese imperial forces during the Second World War in our part of the world, people demanded change. They said, if we live in a democratic society and we've sacrificed our lives for those principles, then we need change. And that's why we saw the election of a Labor government which had a cradle-to-grave social security policy in Britain. And in Australia, when returned servicemen and women were facing homelessness, were bivouacked in Melbourne's MCG in the Botanic Gardens, that the struggle for public housing began. So, not the soldier settlements of the First World War, where people were given land that was not arable, they were set up to fail, but actually have a roof over their heads because of their service. So let's look at the different types of democracy. You've got parliamentary democracy with no constitutional protections for the individual, whether it's for physical protections or protections in terms of freedom of association, freedom of speech. Then you have parliamentary democracies where people have the right to recall non-performing representatives in the parliamentary arena. We don't have that right in Australia. There is no power of recall in our parliamentary system. I could promise you the world, and when I'm elected to Parliament I could do the exact opposite. And there's nothing you can do until the next election, when you may or may not vote me out of office and put your faith in somebody else. So we've got a representative system of a government with no constitutional protection, no power of recall in between elections. Now, some states sovereign states have understood that it's not only Parliament that can initiate legislation, and they have referendums to bypass Parliament. The Swiss are very good at this. If a certain percentage of the population signs a petition that they want a referendum on a particular topic, that referendum is held. And irrespective of the parliamentary party's positions, if that referendum passes, it becomes law. In Australia, not only do we have a parliamentary or a representative democracy with no constitutional protections and no right of recall, we have a system where only Parliament, or the party with the majority in both houses, are the only people who can actually call a referendum, and that's why we have such few referendums, and they determine how the question is structured. So in terms of the old slogan, democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, the system we have here is totally lacking in participation. And that's why we have so many protests constantly. Because people understand that only through direct action can you influence parliamentary policy, because the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have the power to determine what the parliamentary agenda will be. We saw this recently with the changes in the taxation laws, where some minor cosmetic changes made by the Prime Minister and the Labor Party were considered to be heresy by sections of society who are able to exercise power. And that's why we continue to be burdened with homelessness, a lack of public housing, a lack of resources for public health, a lack of resources for public education. Because although the population at large, citizens, elect the government does not take its orders from the citizens who elected it, because there's no power of recall, and they know they're in power till the next election. So they take their marching orders from more powerful elements in society. So what's the alternative? There's a more sophisticated democracy, which is called direct democracy. Unfortunately, direct democracy can only work with an engaged public. And in 2024, the distractions that we are all faced with means that very few people are actually engaged in the political process. They leave it to the politicians. They sit back and complain, saying somebody should do something about that, but not realising that they're the only ones who can do something about that. So parliamentary democracy can succeed without an engaged public. But direct democracy needs an engaged public. Direct democracy is not based on representation, it's based on delegation. And the difference between delegation and representation is the difference between chalk and cheese. Delegates have mandates from particular sections of society, and it's their job to carry that mandate to bigger meetings where people try to coordinate decisions depending on those mandates. For example, say there's an issue about funding public health, You have meetings, can be virtual, they can be town hall meetings, they can be virtual meetings. Certain decisions are made by that particular group. Could be 50 people, could be 5,000 people, could be 500,000 people. They appoint or elect delegates to carry those decisions to a coordinating meeting where other sections of society have sent their delegates. And when a decision is made, it goes back to the Assembly, whether it's virtual or real, for ratification. Delegation is not based on hope. Delegation is based on reality. We saw during the Eureka Rebellion in 1854 mass meetings of up to 20,000 people where they didn't actually have modern PAs. Were able to agree on specific ideas, and they elected and appointed delegates to go down to Melbourne to discuss their demands with the government of the day, the imperial forces based in Melbourne. And then they went back to report on those meetings. Now, direct democracy is much more labour intensive. It's about engagement. It's about people taking an interest in the decision-making processes which ultimately create the type of society we find ourselves in. It's not about shrugging your shoulders and casting a ballot and waiting for another 3 to 4 years to cast another ballot. It's about engagement. So democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's why the fourth estate is so important. And whether it's social media or whether it's the legacy fourth estate. The fact is, the fourth estate continues to provide analysis and has influence on all of us. Now, if those mechanisms of communication are owned by a few individuals or a few corporations, obviously the ideas which are brought forward continually are the same ideas which reinforce the power of those who are able to exercise power and have wealth. So democracy, whether it's direct democracy or representative democracy, where there is the power of recall, where is the power to initiate legislation through referendums, means engagement. There is no place for people who refuse to engage, because that's why we find ourselves in the current situation. We find ourselves in the current situation because we don't engage. Many people say to me, how come, why did the Whitlam-led Labor government in the 70s, in the early 70s, pass so many reforms in 4 years? Very simple. Because they were pushed by an engaged public which wanted change after 20 years of Liberal Country Party rule. They wanted change. They knew change was necessary. It's an engaged public which makes democracy, whether based on representation or delegation, a real mechanism via which people can live lives where there is no want, where there is minimal fear. That's why it's important that we define, redefine what democracy is.